I should like, on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen and of the entire British people, to express our thanks, admiration, affection, and good wishes. We shall not forget you, and we shall watch with the closest interest as you embark on this new era of your remarkable history.
Welcome back to Dragon's Gate for episode 5. In this episode, I'll finally finish off this crazy build that has taken absolute ages to finish. Like I said last episode, I bit off way more than I could chew, and it's just crazy. I first started working on this build at the end of May, and it's taken me all the way until almost mid-July to finish it. Part of the reason for that is because obviously it's a huge build, it's a ton of work, but another reason is I actually recorded 2 different collaborations in June. So after this episode, that will likely be the next 2 videos I release. It depends on their scheduling, so I'm not exactly sure as of the time I'm recording this. But I'm not going to say who they were with, but it was super fun and they were awesome to work with, and I'm thankful to have had those opportunities. But for now, let's just finish this one up. I start out this episode by finishing up the expansion of the top level. I used the same surfaces and PO pillars and walls and such that I used in the last episode, so if you're curious about how I specifically go about that, check out last episode because I'm going to be skipping the vast majority of that for this episode. Most of this episode is dedicated to functionality and detailing. Underneath the main building is where the metro stations sit. So I connected some proper road access with one-way roads as well as another road entrance off to the side. That road entrance that is off to the side will act as kind of a service entrance, and inside there's a couple of block service industrial blocks. I think they only have like 1 or 2 workers max. And also in the large towers, I put some block residential in there as well. And I think I edited Enrico for them to have 15 residents each. So those will actually be used as a functional building. Back at the service entrances, I copied the road entrances from the other side of the elevated rail, and I just adjusted the lights and the clearance bumper for the smaller 2-lane road and removed the animated sign above the entrance. For the entrance to the metro station, I had to make a new one because the gap between the roads was significantly larger. However, I used the same theme and assets and all that. It's just bigger, and I used Move It to make the upper wall overhang just a little bit so it didn't look so flat and boxy. And I also added a couple of those window fronts to add a better looking facade. And of course, all of this entire build is symmetrical, so I had to copy and paste everything onto the opposite side of the building as well. Then there is this area on the side where I wanted to include a pedestrian stairway from ground level all the way up to the upper level. So I created what is essentially a smaller version of the stairs that I had used previously at the very front of the structure that leads to the People's Government Complex. And I even copied and pasted a couple of the rectangular structures that I used there as well. And after that, I figured I needed to provide a road connection to the commercial buildings on the upper level. So I use these one-lane invisible roads. I actually use City Walk City Walls version just to avoid terrain glitchiness. And I connected them up with the shared pedestrian roads on the upper level at the point where the two towers are connected to the Civic Center building. Also at the point where the towers meet the Civic Center building, the elevated metro track actually clips through the building. So I decided to make what is essentially a tunnel for it. I started off by using these Ronix dock surfaces to create a roof along the entire length of the rail up to the station. And then I used more of these PO pillars along the sides and the edges of the roof and covered it all with another retaining wall. Again, matching the theme of the whole build. And I think it turned out great, but I do leave the roof area undetailed this episode. Eventually, I'll go back in another episode and I'll detail it up and put like some small shops or lounging area or restaurants or something up there. For this next part, I probably spent like 3 days just trying to figure out what the heck I wanted to do. Eventually, I asked my friend Tweak, whose channel is in the description, for input, and his outside perspective really helped me knock this out of the park. Whenever you're stuck with a creative block, don't be afraid to ask someone for input, even if they have never played the game before. Because once we collaborated with this for about an hour, it was smooth sailing creatively until the end of this build. So I had created this oddly owl-shaped path layout, and he suggested maybe a large fountain and another area of arranged trees. So first, obviously, I created the fountain because that's the hardest part of this entire section. For the rim, I used these railway siding pieces from Ronix, and after I got the shape I wanted and got it set to the correct height and messed with it for a little bit, I made a copy of it and upgraded the copy to be the retaining walls that are going to be the side walls of the fountain. And I put them together and adjusted the height so that they fit properly and all of that. And then I went to work detailing it. For the floor, I used these pavement networks with some tile decals on top. And then I used this large octagon shaped prop. I'm not really sure who made it or what exactly it even is, but I used it as the base of the fountain with a pillar on top of it, which would be the source of the actual water. And obviously for the fountain, I use these amazing waterfall assets by Kaminogi. And as far as the water itself, you really can't get the in-game water to act properly in this context, so I just use these water surface props and they look great. Once I got the entire fountain together, I moved it into place and surrounded it with grass and a curved gravel path. After I have the fountain in place, I set up about 4 or 5 different sets of planters. Again, I'm using the tree and vehicle prop mod, meaning I can turn some of these trees into procedural objects, but really the only PO trees that I'm using right now are just scaled up or down tulip clusters depending on the planter that I'm making. I use these marble planters, resize them with PO, and put different trees and bushes in them, and I use these triangle props to create a sort of bench that juts out. The first set of these I make was a small one that mostly just goes in front of the railing that faces the train station, and it just has a couple of small bushes with some flowers. The second set I make is a larger one with multiple layers with trees and bushes and flowers that are meant to go alongside the main pathways. And the third one I make has these cypress trees and are meant to go around the outer perimeter of the top level. Aside from those, I make a couple of more with just a single planter with a tree, and I ended up placing all of these around pretty much everywhere on the top level after I get the pathways done. But for now, they're just on the side of these two large grassy areas. And for the second grassy area, I decided not to make a fountain. There's just a gravel path with some planters and some trees and a few bushes strewn around here and there. Next, I take these balustrades and turn them into procedural objects so I can get rid of the long wall pieces on the bottom of them, and I just use them as railings on the upper level above the train station. For the curved area of that, I actually copied the railway siding pieces that I used as the essentially a border and put them down at ground level just to make it a bit easier. And after I get all the balustrades in place from that, then I move them all in the position with Move It. And after that, I start working on the main pathway layout around the main towers. I keep it pretty simple, pretty square, and on the pathways leading up to the building, I use these Venetian tile decals that we used a ton of in the People's Government episode. On the perimeter of that square, I make a wall of planters with alternating trees and large bushes at varying heights, and in front of that wall, I put a row of red bushes and a row of small hydrangea bushes. Along the pathways inside the square, I put some more of the small planter sets I made, and then I finished it off with some tile decals, but apparently I didn't record that part for some reason. I thought I did, but apparently not. Anyways, after that, I use a ton of grass to fill in between the two towers, and along those paths, I use more of that planter set. Then I finish up the rest of the pathways along the upper level. I keep everything pretty much straight and square, except a couple of pathways that split off that lead to the corner stairway structures. And I put in some grass and planter sets and a few trees here and there, and that finishes up the entire front part of the upper level. Next, I move on to the mid-level where the train station sits. I wanted there to be kind of a centerpiece, and so I used this giant star monument from Ronix, and I scaled it way down to fit in front of the train station. Then I went off to the side and made a small circle with the railway siding pieces, and inside of it I put in another circle of these light-up cubes that City Wall made. And then I just moved it all into position under the star. And after that, I made a sort of concave triangle design with grass networks and rounded them out with these circular grass surfaces. Then off to the side, I took some white curbs and made all the nodes that I needed to make a border around the grass. And then I just used Move It to shape the nodes and segments to fit around the grass, and added a couple of the small planter sets from earlier and a couple of large bushes and some cypress trees around the star. After that, I spent a ton of time editing pathways and setting up the layout on this level. Basically, there's like 6 pathways arrayed out from the center, and they all take you to different places. The center 2 lead to a couple of stairways that get you to the long pathway on the top level. Then the middle 2 paths lead out to the second level shopping areas. And the 2 on the sides lead to pathways that take you towards the Civic Center and metro stations. And also in the middle of doing all of that, I added a few large signs to the front of the train station. Then I took some more of those curbs and used them to finish off the basic layout of the area. I had to do a little more editing of the paths just to make it a little bit more symmetrical, which can be pretty difficult to do at times in this game. Then I changed up the surfaces a bit because I wanted this area to stand out a bit differently from the rest of the structure. So instead of using the brick surfaces that I used on the entire rest of the build, I used a different color concrete, and I placed it in all the areas that were not pathways. And on the pathways, I just used the standard pavement that we've been using. And then I changed it to night just to be able to see a little more easily without darker shadows, but I ran into an issue where the lights from the upper level were shining through the structure, lighting up the mid-level in front of the train station. That was kind of odd, but anyways, I lined the pathways with some more planters with some smaller trees, and then I started making this waiting area with a ton of benches and covered them up with these parking lot roofs that I scaled down with PO, and I imagine it gets quite hot outside during the day here, so this would be a nice shaded and cooled area even though it's still open air. Then on one side I placed down this glass metro entrance asset with PO, and behind it I kind of made like a restaurant or eating area with some covered tables, and I put in a few vending machines and little kiosks here and there. I also created this ticket and baggage area, but the footage for that got corrupted somehow, which is really unfortunate because it was quite an interesting build. Next up, I moved to the back side of the train station and work on the paths that lead into the metro station. This one I thought was going to be pretty simple, but the entire time I fought with random terrain spikes, and also there's a ton of various networks in this area, like grass surface networks and pathways, terraforming networks, and all of that, which made using Move It kind of annoying at times, but the end product actually does end up looking pretty good. I actually threw out my original idea for this space as a sort of customs area because this is the only station you can get to from the train line that comes from the southern city. But in order to save on the already massive amount of props and such I was using, I decided to make a more simple approach. Basically, all I did here was create two grassy areas surrounded by paths, and I added some bushes and some more of those planter sets with the cypress trees. All in all, I think the train station looks quite nice. There's another couple of little details I think I could add later on, but I'm not necessarily planning on doing it quite yet because I have other bigger plans that I want to start moving forward with, and this area, like I said, it took forever to do, and I just kind of want to move on to the next thing. Once I finished the train station, the next thing I had to do was finish the backside of the structure. This is something I kind of avoided, kind of dreaded a little bit, because I could never really decide how I wanted to approach it, and everything I kind of did at first just didn't look up to par with the rest of the build. Part of that is because there's less space to work with, but the bigger issue is that there's just not much going on back here. But I start out by placing the paths from the side staircases that lead out to the main roads. Instead of the regular surfaces that I've been using, I decided to use these roof surface networks, and I doubled them up to make it a wide path, and there's an invisible pedestrian path underneath to make it functional. After that, on the upper level, I add the rest of the various shops around the outside of the Civic Center building and move the shared road so that everything fits better. And then on ground level, and by the way, I kind of go back and forth on this, it's just the way I recorded it, and it's easier to edit it this way, but anyways, I put two sections of loading docks with some office space in the middle along the entire length of the rear of the structure. Inside of the loading docks, in random ones, I put some of these industrial block services, and inside the towers that kind of serve as the stairways / entrances, I put some office block services, so people will work there and it'll all be functional. And I add some trees out in front of the office space and some tile decals going into the entrances. And across the street from it, I make this parking lot using the parking lot roads for the various workers on this side of the building. Like I said, I go back and forth from top level to bottom level while building this, so the next thing I make is all the paths for the upper level. Again, I keep it simple, kind of rectangular. There's not much activity going on back here, so it mostly just serves functional purposes. And I just decorate it with more grass surfaces and those same planter sets that I've been using. And going back down to the loading docks, I put in a few truck props in spaces that did not have the block surfaces behind them. And then I had this open space in the corner between the back road and the road entrances to the metro stations. After messing with it for a bit, I decided to make it a parking lot for more of the various workers in this building. And I just used some more parking lot roads, added some windows to the side of the building and a couple of doors, and I finished it off with some simple foliage. A cool little detail of this part is this random service door that leads to the metro entrances, and I put a small light over it. It's just a tiny detail and it adds a little bit of realism. But that parking lot created another open space between it and the main road, and so I decided to put a small office building there with a parking lot across the street. There's not much detail there with that, but it's just a good use of space. As much as I didn't know what to do with the back of the building, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with these train track entrances. I wanted to have this cool glass overhang feature. At first, I used the glass surface props as procedural objects, but it didn't quite have the look I wanted, so I switched to these awning props that I scaled up as PO. It took me a minute to get the scaling right and the rotation right because the glass and the support come as two separate props. After I got the glass scaled properly and all of that, it was just a matter of using control drag method of copying, and it looked great, so I set out to make pillars to hold it up. I used these same Ronix Expressway pillars that I've been using with a row of vertical ones that are connected together by another row of horizontal ones. And I made sure the vertical ones stuck through the roof because I ended up adding some lights later on after I got it all set up. And then it was just a matter of copying it to the opposite side of the building so the glass feature is on both sides and everything is symmetrical and all of that. And I wanted to do something similar for the elevated metro, and this time the glass surface props worked amazingly. All I did was scale one slightly down and control drag until I had the length that I needed. And to support it, I took another pillar and made it really long and tilted it a bit so it was diagonal. And I placed them at regular intervals along the glass. I actually made them slightly too tall at first and they didn't exactly reach the ground, so I had to go back and fix that later on, and that's what I get for putting trees down first. Anyways, along the outside of the plane of glass, I used more horizontal PO pillars to create kind of a border around it, and it adds a little bit of a thicker look, and I end up really happy with the way it turned out, even more so than the train glass feature. Then, in the opposite corner of where I made that parking lot and office building, I did the same exact thing, but I rearranged it a bit. I used one large parking lot instead of two different size ones, and for the office I used this aquatic center which just barely fit in between the roads, but it worked out. And it also gets its own parking lot, but it's on the same side of the road this time, and in the end I just go around adding bits of trees and bushes and a fence and a gate entrance to the parking lot. And the last thing I do in this section is connect up the railway to the greater region. There's one rail that directly connects to the southern city and just doesn't go anywhere else, and the rest go to all the different train connections throughout the map. With all of that complete, that left one, really two, places that were left unfinished, and that was the empty areas between the main roads and the building itself. My first thought was to put more special purpose buildings like a library or concert hall or something, but we already have a couple of those kinds of buildings over next to the People's Government. So I went back to Google Maps and in Shenzhen and decided, why not just have it be a green space? So I start on the east side park by making some pedestrian paths around the perimeter and through the park. On the outside of the perimeter pathways, I put a row of regular bushes and 2 rows of red and yellow azalea bushes and a row of trees along the edge of the actual pathways. And there were a couple spots where there was a break between the trees and the bushes, so in that space I just added a couple more variations of bushes just to fill it out. And then I actually remember that Park Life DLC is a thing, so I make a park district and put in some park entrances. I end up using the advertising campaign and main park policies to hopefully get a ton of Sims to actually use the area. And then I plop down a couple of little shop things and a gazebo and a couple of park people generators just to add some destinations for the Sims and give them even more reason to take a trip there. And I just cover most of it with my tree brush, but I'm sure to leave a couple of empty spaces that I surround with palm trees, and I add a couple of dirt decals to give it a more natural look. Then I move over to the other area on the west side where I had been using it as a place to assemble things like the balustrades and such on ground level before I moved them onto the actual building. I moved all of that stuff out of the way and had a similar approach as the first park, with perimeter paths lined with trees and bushes. However, inside of that layout was a little bit different because I wanted to have some sort of feature in the middle. For looking at Shenzhen again, they have this really long and narrow field of sunflowers in the middle of their park, so I kind of wanted to do something similar. I went on the workshop and thankfully there was a sunflower asset made by Mr. Mason, who makes amazing, all kinds of just epic nature stuff, so go subscribe to all of his stuff. Anyways, I used the forest brush at first, but the sunflowers didn't go all the way to the edge of the path like I wanted, even when I turned on tree and prop anarchy. So I kind of went off to the side and made a bundle of them and just copied them all over to that place with Move It. And I actually ended up pasting way too many of them, so I had to go back with the forest brush on very low strength and remove a good bit of them. And then once I had done that, I surrounded them with a row of tiny bushes, and I planned on using hedges, but all the hedges I'm subscribed to are too tall relative to the sunflowers. And really the rest of the park is laid out with trees and bushes, much the same as the first park. Both of these parks turned out looking great, but it's a ton of trees and it's definitely hitting performance a pretty substantial amount, so I may have to go back later on and remove some. But that pretty much finishes out this build, which took way too long to do, and I'm both very happy with the results and very much ready to move on to a different kind of building style. This build was a ton of procedural objects and placing things on surface assets rather than on the ground itself, with a ton of layers of networks and surfaces and props and trees and everything. Some parts were super fun to build and others were just a huge grind, but like I said, I think it turned out pretty friggin' good. So if you like what I built, leave a like and I'll ask you to subscribe as well. If you didn't like it, let me know why in the comments, but I'll still ask you to subscribe. One last thing I want to mention is that I'm using a new mic and a new audio editing software, so I apologize if the audio is a bit wonky this episode. It'll probably be fixed by the next episode, but I mean, I'm still working on it. Anyways, it's likely my next couple videos will actually be collab builds, but the next Dragon's Gate episode I will likely start on the Central Business District. That's what I'm planning as of this recording anyways. But hopefully you enjoyed everything, and I'm super grateful you've watched this far, and I hope to see you next time at Dragon's Gate.